Let's start with a simple truth. Civilizations don't last.
Rome collapsed. The Maya collapsed. The Vikings collapsed. And when we say collapsed, we don't mean everybody drops dead at once like extras in a bad disaster movie. Collapse is what happens when the systems that hold a society together, trade, politics, culture, even meaning itself, stop working. People survive, but the world they knew doesn't. That's the big picture. And to understand it, we're going to zoom in on one of history's most charismatic cautionary tales, the Vikings. They're not the whole story. They're just exhibit A in a pattern that spans thousands of years. In the late 8th century, Scandinavia was booming, not because of longboats yet, but because of barley. Warmer weather and better farming techniques meant more food, more babies, more pressure. Think of it as the medieval version of a housing crisis. Too many kids, not enough land.
Add to this a fun little legal quirk. Primogeniture. The eldest son inherited the farm. The younger sons, they got socks, maybe a goat, and a deep sense of injustice. So, what do you do with a generation of angry, landless young men? If you said you put them on boats and tell them to go find something better, well, congrats, you're a terrible parent. But either way, find something they did. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 was such a jackpot, gold, slaves, prestige, that it lit the fuse on centuries of expansion. Raids turned into settlements, settlements into colonies. Greenland, Iceland, Russia, even a brief foray into North America. Vikings went viral, but here's the trick. Jared Diamond calls this kind of growth autocatalytic. Success feeds more success. A raid works, so more raiders join. Colonies thrive, so more colonists leave. It snowballs. And like any snowball, it eventually smashes into something immovable. It's tempting to think the Vikings were special, that their rise and fall was a quirky Norse thing. But the truth? Civilizations everywhere follow the same script. Look at the Indus Valley Civilization, thriving between 2600 and 1900 BCE. Their cities had plumbing and standardized weights, incredible for the time. But when monsoons shifted and rivers dried, the urban system unraveled. Populations shrank, cities emptied, trade collapsed. People didn't vanish, but the civilization did. Or take the classic Maya, around the 9th century CE. They built towering pyramids, mapped the stars, and filled jungles with cities. But mega-droughts, internal wars, and social stress pushed them past the breaking point. Palaces burned, dynasties crumbled, and great centers like Tikal were abandoned. Even Rome, with legions, aqueducts, and emperors, cracked under the weight of political chaos, economic strain, and barbarian invasions. The empire that once called itself eternal, first split in half, then got shattered into scattered kingdoms. Different places, different times, but the pattern's the same. Growth until resistance hardens, wealth until inequality deepens, expansion until the environment refuses to cooperate. Sound familiar? Expansion, inequality, violence. Split, or disappear, give or take. From the Vikings to the Indus Valley, it's the same cycle dressed in different costumes. Growth feels unstoppable until resistance hardens. Wealth piles up until it fractures society. The environment provides until it doesn't. Collapse isn't a glitch, it's the pattern. The irony is that the very engines of growth are also the seeds of destruction. More land means more mouths. More wealth means more conflict. More expansion means more resistance. Civilizations accelerate until they can't. The Vikings' boats and bravery made them masters of Europe's coasts for 3 centuries. But every raid created stronger defenses. Every colony stretched supply lines thinner. Every success raised expectations until the only way forward was more. And then, as always, more wasn't possible. By the 11th century, resistance from kingdoms like England stiffened, while internal shifts, kings pushing Christianization, elites trading raids for continental legitimacy, undercut the old culture of plunder. By 1066 at Stamford Bridge, a Viking army met its match and was crushed. The age of the axe was over. Here's the key. Collapse doesn't mean everyone dies. It means the system dies. After Rome fell, people still lived in Italy. They just didn't call it an empire anymore. When the Maya cities emptied, their descendants didn't vanish. They farmed in smaller villages. After the Vikings, Scandinavians didn't disappear. They became farmers, traders, and Christians. Collapse is transformation by force, a hard reset. And the Vikings? They're just one case study in the oldest lesson history teaches us. Civilizations collapse not in spite of their strengths, but because of them. And sometimes collapse doesn't just kill systems. It rewrites humanity itself. DNA, plagues, bottlenecks. Up next, how entire lineages were erased and why collapse literally changed who we are. Let's set the scene. 25th September 1066, Stamford Bridge, England. The Norse king Harald Hardrada arrives with thousands of warriors. This is the guy nicknamed the Thunderbolt of the North, a walking raid in human form. But that day, he's met by King Harold Godwinson's army, and things go south. By nightfall, the Vikings are massacred. Hardrada himself gets an arrow through the throat. Ouch. Historians love that date because it's neat and dramatic. One battle, one defeat, signs the symbolic end to the Viking Age. But in truth, the fall wasn't an overnight tragedy. It was a slow-motion unraveling already decades in the making. One big reason for that unraveling? Faith. The same Norse kings who once worshipped Odin and Thor started baptizing themselves and their people, not out of sudden piety, but politics. Aligning with Christian Europe gave them legitimacy, allies, and trade deals. Problem is, you can't raid monasteries with one hand while crossing yourself with the other. The more kings turned to Christianity, the less acceptable raiding became. Elites, who once flaunted stolen treasure, now flaunted cathedrals and church alliances. The Viking identity that had fueled centuries of expansion got watered down from the top down. At the same time, power was centralizing. Kings were pulling authority away from local chieftains, tying loyalty to crowns rather than clan. The culture of independent raiding parties faded as royal armies, taxes, and laws replaced it. What once made them terrifying, their decentralized, unpredictable strikes, was exactly what rulers tried to suppress. And outside Scandinavia, the neighbors had learned their lesson. England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire built castles, militias, and naval defenses. The first raids in the 8th and 9th centuries had been easy pickings. By the 11th, hitting those same coasts was like robbing the same bank 3 times. The guards were waiting. Even expansion west hit a wall. The Vinland colony in North America, founded around the year 1000, fizzled quickly. Why? Constant clashes with indigenous peoples. The sagas describe them as Skrallings, strangers. But strangers who could fight back hard enough to convince the Norse to pack up and leave. Closer to home, settlements in Scotland, Ireland, and northern France slowly assimilated or were pushed out. What had once looked like an unstoppable tide was now trickling backwards. Here's the cruel part. Collapse feels worse not when you're weak, but when you've been strong. Humans hate losing what they've grown used to. Psychologists call it loss aversion. If you've expanded for 3 centuries, plateauing doesn't feel like stability. It feels like humiliation. Every setback burns. For the Vikings, expansion was normal. Raids, colonies, tribute, that was life. So when defeats stacked up, when colonies failed, when kings stopped encouraging raids, it wasn't just a political or economic shift. It was an identity crisis. Being Viking meant being on the move, taking more. Without that, who were they? Nowhere is the Viking downfall clearer than in Greenland. When Eric the Red established the colony in 985, the climate was relatively mild. The land really was green compared to icy Scandinavia. Farms flourished, cattle grazed, churches rose. At its peak, maybe 5,000 Norse lived there. Not bad for an Arctic outpost, but around the 13th century, the weather turned. The so-called Little Ice Age shortened growing seasons. Sea ice blocked supply ships. Trade with Europe dwindled. Here's the tragic twist. Instead of adapting to local conditions, Greenlanders doubled down on European farming habits. Archaeological digs show cattle bones even when pastures were failing, a sign they clung to cows as status symbols, even as seals and fish could have fed them better. Inuit neighbors thrived on marine hunting, but the Norse stuck to their old playbook until famine hollowed them out. By the 1400s, the settlements were gone. Churches abandoned, farms deserted, graves filled with malnourished skeletons. Not conquered, not assimilated, just erased by cold, hunger, and stubbornness. So what killed the Vikings? All of it. Internal shifts like Christianization and kings suppressing raids. External blows like stronger enemies and failed colonies. Environmental shifts that froze their supply lines. And above all, a psychology that couldn't handle shrinking after centuries of growth. Collapse rarely has one cause. It's a pileup. Political, cultural, environmental, psychological. The Vikings aren't a special case. They're just a particularly vivid one. And when civilizations fall, survivors don't just walk away. They tell stories, myths, epics, prophecies, ways to make collapse sound like destiny instead of disaster. Next, how the Viking idea of Ragnarok fits into a much older pattern of cultures turning trauma into legend. When civilizations fall, they don't just leave ruins, they leave stories, and those stories rarely say, "We messed up." Instead, collapse gets spun into legend, destiny, or divine will. Because nobody likes to admit they simply ran out of luck, out of food, or even lacked some good sense. For the Vikings, the ultimate collapse wasn't Stamford Bridge or the frozen farms of Greenland. It was Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. According to Norse myth, the world ends in fire and ice, the gods themselves fall, and almost everything is wiped away. But out of the ashes, a few survivors rebuild. Sound familiar? It's basically civilizational collapse with a marketing department. Instead of admitting, "Our rating economy doesn't work anymore," especially when people fight back a lot, you say, "Ah yes, the cosmos itself decreed it." Collapse becomes not failure, but fate. And this isn't just a Viking thing. The Mahabharata in India tells of a colossal war that nearly exterminated humanity. Greek poets sang of a heroic age when endless wars left the world stripped of its champions. These myths all point to the same cultural reflex. When systems crumble, survivors wrap the trauma in story. Part of the reason we need myths is because history itself doesn't keep good records. Archaeology is biased. What survives is what's hard enough, dry enough, or lucky enough not to rot. Everything else is gone. That's why the old theory of the 50,000-year creative explosion made sense for so long. Europeans dug up cave paintings in France and Germany and assumed that's when humans got smart. Only later did we realize Africans had been engraving ochre and making beads tens of thousands of years earlier. It just didn't survive in the soil. So when we look for collapse in the record, we mostly see silence. A city abandoned, pottery styles vanishing, graves emptied. But silence isn't absence, it's erasure. Floods, volcanoes, rising seas, or just time doing what time does. Civilizations may have risen and vanished long before we can prove they existed. In a way, myths are the only fossils of those lost collapses. War turned into epic poetry. Floods turned into divine punishment. Drought turned into judgment from the gods. It's memory distorted, but memory nonetheless. Take the Maya. Their monumental cities in the rainforest collapsed in the 9th century, triggered by mega-droughts and internal wars. But descendants didn't vanish, they carried on in smaller communities. The mythic memory, though, is of abandoned pyramids swallowed by jungle, as if the entire people disappeared overnight. Rome? The empire fractured, trade routes collapsed, political chaos reigned. But in Christian memory, the fall became the triumph of a new order. Out of collapse, destiny again. Even Egypt, which managed millennia of continuity, suffered repeated breakdowns. Intermediate periods of famine, civil war, and foreign invasion. Pharaohs vanished, scribes stopped writing, monuments stopped rising. Later dynasties reframed these pauses as necessary purges, a cleansing before renewal. Collapse repeats so often it should feel boring, but we dress it up with myths so it feels cosmic instead of catastrophic. Here's the part where it gets uncomfortable. Collapse isn't just a Viking problem, or a Maya problem, or a Roman problem. It's a human problem. And the uncomfortable truth is this: the ingredients that brought them down haven't gone anywhere. They're all still here, simmering beneath our modern surface. Environmental fragility? Same story. Ancient Sumer salted its fields into desert through over-irrigation. The Maya depended on rains that failed. We depend on global supply chains that can snap in weeks. Take the United States. In 2025, billion-dollar climate disasters are so common that NOAA barely bothers to count them one by one anymore. Wildfires in California, hurricanes battering the Gulf, megadroughts squeezing the Southwest. Together, they now cost the U.S. over $150 billion every year. Entire towns have been burned off the map, crops shrivel in once fertile valleys, and infrastructure cracks under the strain. Collapse doesn't need an invading army when the price of rebuilding just keeps climbing. On the other side of the world, China is walking its own tightrope. The Yangtze Basin, home to hundreds of millions of people, is whiplashing between extremes. Record floods one year, catastrophic droughts the next. Factories shut down when dams run low. Harvests vanish when the rains don't come. The Chinese Communist Party still promises stability through growth. But what happens when the very river that built Chinese civilization no longer plays along? A civilization can be brought to its knees not by enemies at the gate, but by weather that refuses to follow the script. And Europe? This summer saw southern cities roasting at 45 degrees Celsius. Portugal begged for international firefighting support as flames raced through forests. France recorded thousands of heat-related deaths in just a few weeks. Italy's rivers shrank to trickles, barges stranded in mud. For a continent that once built castles to keep Vikings out, the new threat isn't raiders, it's climate itself. And it doesn't retreat when the campaigning season ends. These shocks aren't isolated. They're woven into global systems. Supply chains have been disturbed by a tariff spat between Washington and Beijing. Though not entirely cut off, it can ripple all the way to supermarket shelves in Paris. A drought in the Yangtze can starve European factories of parts. On the energy side, war in Ukraine showed how fragile Europe's fuel supplies are, with one pipeline shut off rattling economies from Berlin to Rome, highlighting how most European countries were dependent on Russian gas. Finally, on the food topic, in the summer of 2025, extreme heat and dryness hit U.S. wheat belts, pushing futures markets sharply upward. In early July, wheat contracts jumped about 4% in a single week as traders priced in the risk of reduced harvests. That shock quickly fed through the food chain. The average price of a loaf of bread in the U.S. rose from about $2.50 in 2024 to $2.68 in mid-2025, an increase of 7% year-on-year. The effect wasn't just local. Because U.S. wheat exports anchor global supply, the Kansas heatwave of 2025 was felt as far as Cairo and Jakarta, where importers faced higher flour costs within weeks. Globalization gave us abundance, but also fragility. Our prosperity depends on threads so thin they can snap overnight. And loss aversion? Still here. The Norse clung to cattle even as their pastures froze, because giving them up felt like surrendering their identity. We cling to oil, coal, and endless growth curves because slowing down feels like failure. Different century, same trap. Strengths that once made us powerful are now liabilities we can't bear to let go of. And the myth-making? Oh, we've got plenty. From techno-utopias promising salvation through Mars colonies to doomsday prophecies of AI or climate collapse. We're still turning uncertainty into story so we don't have to face the raw chaos of systems breaking down. Civilizations don't fall because they're weak. They fall because they're rigid in the wrong moment. Because their strengths, expansion, hierarchy, faith, technology, become liabilities when the world shifts. The Vikings were doomed because they couldn't stop being Vikings when the world demanded something else. And that's the legacy every society wrestles with. Can you change fast enough when your environment, your neighbors, your own psychology all shift under your feet? Or do you keep marching until you find your Stamford Bridge waiting for you? And us? We're not immune. We're just in the middle of the story, telling ourselves it's not about us. And if that wasn't enough, here's a little something to make you think at night. When Rome fell, or when the Maya cities emptied, collapse was regional. Painful, yes, but survivable elsewhere. Today, the system is planetary. If the US wobbles, global finance shudders. If China staggers, supply chains seize. If Europe burns, food and energy prices spike everywhere. We've built one giant civilization, which means if it collapses, there's no safe harbor anymore. We've got better tools. Satellites, science, early warning systems. But the same sins remain: denial, inertia, pride. So the real question isn't whether collapse will happen again, because it will. It's whether we'll recognize the ice closing in our own harbors before it's too late. Because history doesn't whisper, it echoes. And right now it's echoing louder than ever. If this journey through collapse made you rethink the Vikings or Rome, or maybe even us today, don't let it end here. Hit the like button if you want more stories that cut through the myths and get to the bones of history. Subscribe so you don't miss the next dive into the echoes of our past. Because trust me, they get louder every time. And drop a comment. Which collapse do you think looks the most like our present? Rome? The Maya? Or are we just writing our own saga right now? Your clicks, your thoughts, your curiosity, they're the fuel that keeps this channel alive. So thank you for watching, and until next time, keep listening to the echoes.